The Affordable Care Act was signed into law 6 years ago. It is the most important piece of legislation in President Obama's presidency. But the question is, what will happen? Republicans have been fighting it for quite some time. They are desperate to repeal it, even though they've been grossly unsuccessful. They've had, some almost 60 votes, and they've all failed. Joining us right now is the author of a book, 150 Years of Obamacare, Daniel E. Dawes, and he says black folks have better recognize that what happens in November could very well play a role as to whether or not this law stays on the books. So, Daniel, why do you make that case? How has this law been that critical to the health of America?
So the way I make the case is going back 150 years. And a lot of folks, black leaders that I've spoken to, said, I didn't even know we had a health reform law 150 years ago. We had that law, and it was in place for 7 years. It was set to help newly freed people, African Americans primarily. And after 7 years, Congress dismantled it. We're now in the 6th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act. And if we are not careful, if we don't understand what is at stake and what this law contains, we can actually repeat history.
And so that was one of those Reconstruction laws.
That's right, the Freedmen's Freedmen's Bureau Act. And
what's interesting is, and I make this point, when you look at the polls, when people say they don't support the Affordable Care Act, that's because a significant number of people felt it should have been stronger. It's not that you have a majority of Americans who say, I don't want the law, period. Is that a significant 35% that say, no, I want to be even stronger than what that law is.
Right. Well, let me tell you, and that's a valid argument. This is a first step in the right direction, and it is actually the most comprehensive minority health law we've ever had in the United States, and the most inclusive law we've ever had passed by Congress. And the reason I mean that is because in this law, in the Affordable Care Act, are 62 provisions directly addressing inequities in health care and health status. And we know African Americans, 83,000 African Americans die each year due to disparities in health care. This law is intended to help alleviate some of that and decrease the disparities.
Where do you think we've gotten this contradiction between, states like Kentucky, where you had, a Republican governor, I'm going to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, or states like South Carolina, and yet they're the most aggressive states in sucking up that sort of Affordable Care Act money? Where did that contradiction come from, where on the one hand you're going to say you don't want the policy, but you desperately bring it in for the people in your state?
I think it's a lot of times it's interesting. I think it's because it's tied to Obama's legacy, President Obama's legacy. And I'll tell you, in the South, I know I've been involved in negotiations where folks are meeting behind closed doors, trying to think of ways to get Medicaid expanded in the states. But because it is tied to Obamacare, they won't touch it. Or we've seen tremendous grant funding, where you're right, some of them will take some of the funding. They don't necessarily say it's tied to it, but as soon as it's explicit in, let's say, grant proposal, they won't even touch it. So oftentimes what we're seeing now in the South are grants that say you have to get a letter from your governor or the Medicaid office in order to get the billions of dollars in funding. So it's been an issue, yeah.
Joy?
This sounds like the consistent behavior of people voting against their own best interest because of race or culture. And that the people who have benefited most, the people who now are wearing caps and supporting Donald Trump, the poor white person, who now is in this chant of killing off Obamacare while they're benefiting from it.
That's right.
While they had no health care before.
Yeah, 8 million, actually 9 million Caucasians have benefited from the law, more than any other racial group. And
all them poor, broke white folks.
That's right.
In Mississippi, Alabama. No, you gotta call it what it is.
That's right.
Broke is broke. And these poor white folks are stuck on stupid in Mississippi, Alabama, West Virginia, Louisiana,
Texas.
Arkansas, Texas, all these other states with the worst health care, and they say, I don't want Medicaid expansion, but they drop it like flies. In fact, the reason that the black, in terms of how we're living, the gap is closing because white folks are dying because of opioids.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And actually, and to your point too, this is actually interesting because this is the lowest uninsurance rate we have ever seen in this country. And it's gone down 50% for whites, 50% for African Americans.
Right.
But they by far have benefited the most from this. So great point.
Ted Cruz is making these speeches.
I have a question about people in the South specifically,
Yes.
because that's where I live. How can people that live there who want Medicaid expansion, who are under these Republican governors and Republican legislatures, how can they move that legislation forward in their state?
When they wake the hell up? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
That's a valid argument. That is a valid argument. It's something that we're trying to figure out ourselves. We've tried to make the moral argument. That didn't work. We've tried to make the economic argument. That hasn't worked. And we're scratching our heads trying to figure out how that is. So if you know, please help us.
Probably a ballot box issue then.
I believe so, yes.
No,
I think
this goes back to slavery. This goes back to slavery. Poor whites don't think that they have the same fundamental problems as African Americans in these states when it comes to health care, when it comes to education, when it comes to economics. And that's what this all goes back to. And they still stuck in the twilight zone, somehow thinking, no, I might be Donald Trump one day, when they got diabetes, they're dying of strokes, heart attacks, and everything else,
Just like
because they don't want to accept the reality that they're in the same condition, rural whites, as black folks are as well.
Can I tell you, actually, so, and you're absolutely right, every single time that we have tried over the last 150 years to pass comprehensive health reform, folks have always infused race and gender into the debates to discredit the opportunities, right? And we saw that last year even with the opposing counsel in the King versus Burwell case, that second major Supreme Court case on the ACA, where when he was interviewed, he said, they asked him, what's the difference between the two major Supreme Court cases? He says, the first one's dealing with the intent of dead white men, and the second one is dealing with the intent of women and minorities who wrote this bill. And I'm glad they recognize the impact and the inclusivity of the law, but that is exactly what they've recycled throughout the years.
Hold on 1 second. I gotta go to a break. I'm gonna come back with this without What the Hell Thursday, which we normally do. Actually, we've had about 5 What the Hell Thursdays already, and so we're gonna continue this conversation back on News 1 Now TV 1.